The ego concept is the root cause of all delusion and therefore all trouble. It is the false identification of I with the body rather than with the self. Ego is the concept of individuality, of separation from the I and the all. Therefore, ego is a false assumption. We are really the I, we are not separate from it. Meaning, we are the true self, the oneness, consciousness. When this true self, consciousness, the real I, identifies with the body and believes that it is a separate individual entity, separate from all other forms, then this is delusion. Falsely identifying with the body, individual body, and thinking that it is a separate entity, it's a delusion and it's the root cause of all trouble. The ego is all the evil there is, and your self, true self, is all the good there is. Whatever evil in this world is just because of the delusion that I am a separate individual entity. All the good there is the establishing oneself in the true self, the consciousness which is common to all bodies, all forms, which is the only one consciousness existing. All good is establishing oneself as that, not as a separate individual ego entity. The ego is the source of birth and death, and when the ego is let go of, you die to death. Ego is the source of birth and death, and when the ego is let go of, you die to death itself. When a wave thinks that it's a separate individual entity in the sea, which is totally separate from all other waves and bubbles, then it has a birth, it is subject to birth and death. But when the wave identifies itself with the sea water, that is, it escapes the death itself because it can never die. The sea water never dies. Only a wave is born and wave dies. Only the body is born and the body dies, changes its form. But when we identify with the essence, the source out of which the body arises and body goes back, when we identify ourselves with the true self, which is the source of all the names and forms, which is the source of the entire universe, the true self out of which the entire universe arises and goes back, when we identify with that, then we don't have any birth or death. We escape the death itself. The delusion that I am an individual entity with a particular form is the cause of birth and death. Everything that is not good has its source in the ego sense and is therefore unreal. Our real nature is an ultimate goodness. Everything of the ego is the opposite of everything of the self. Everything an ego sees is a lie in the light of truth. Everything an ego sees is in duality. An ego can't see oneness. The ego has an eye of duality only. There is nothing true that an ego sees. And on the opposite, the self sees only the truth, the self. When we identify ourselves with the self-consciousness, the existence consciousness bliss, which is beyond the body, mind, ego, individual sense, which we experience daily in our deep sleep without the body, mind, ego. We exist as pure consciousness itself without the body, mind, ego. When we identify ourselves with this consciousness, then when we look from consciousness, when we look from the true self, which is the formless existence, consciousness, out of which we The consciousness is awareness which is aware of the ego itself, the body itself, the mind itself. When we identify ourselves with this awareness and we look ourselves and the world from the place of awareness, we see only awareness. We see only consciousness. We see only true self. When we look through the body, mind, ego, then we look other body, mind, egos. When we identify ourselves as an individual entity, then we will look only individuals outside. The ego cannot see the true self. The ego can see only other egos. The body can see only other bodies. Only the self can see the self everywhere. When we identify ourselves from the true self, it's consciousness, and when we see from there, we will see only consciousness everywhere. The coloring agent of the truth is ego. The less the ego, the less the coloring of truth. When there is only one true self appearing as everything, all the names and forms are just a movement of the true self. All the forms are just a movement of the true self. Like all the waves are just a movement of the sea water. The entire universe is just a movement. It's just an appearance in the true self, the consciousness. What actually is only one consciousness. So, the ego colors this truth. Only the ego sees from the point of view of the ego, the same one consciousness is seen as multiplicity. The stronger the ego, the stronger we see multiplicity, and we miss the one eternal true self. The entire trouble is wrong identity. We say we are the limited ego, but in actuality we are the unlimited formless self appearing as body, mind, ego. Temporarily appearing as body, mind, ego. Whether the sea water appears as a wave or waveless ocean, the sea water is never damaged. So it doesn't have any trouble. Only if we identify that I am an individual wave, then we are in trouble. So the entire trouble is just a wrong identity. We think we are just a name and form. But we are this existence, consciousness, bliss which is appearing as a name and form. As all the names and forms. When we have the correct identity, that I am the existence, consciousness, bliss, Satchitananda, Brahman, appearing as the entire universe. Whether the universe is there or not there, I will always be there. Whether this Brahman appears as the universe or without the names and forms, Brahman is always Brahman, consciousness is always there. When we have this right identity, then there is no trouble. Just this twist of identity, shift of identity will solve all the troubles eternally. This one key can open all the locks. There is only one solution for all the troubles. There is one key for freedom and liberation, that is correct identity. How can there be an individual independent of every other thing? When the breathing is happening by itself, heart is beating by itself, gravitational force is acting, temperature is maintained, oxygen concentration in the air is maintained. When there are 1,000 and other factors for a thought to arise inside a human being, for an action to happen, how can an individual take responsibility of everything? When even for the existence of the body, we need 1,000 and n factors, which are interdependent. How can there be an individual? This individual sense is a pure imagination and delusion. There is only one thing appearing as everything. There is only one single growth, and that is letting go of the ego. The more we let go of this false sense of individuality, the more we grow into peace, the more we grow into our true self. We have picked up this false imagination, delusion from childhood. From day one of birth, the child doesn't have any individual sense. It has not even identified with its body. Then slowly, the I, the original I, the self, gets into this delusion that I am an individual. I am just this body. I am just this separate individual body, and my name is this, and my identity is this, family identity, national identity. Then slowly it gets into trouble. So the only growth is letting go of this delusion and again come back to the original nature, to the day one of birth, where the child sees nothing other than the self. It doesn't see the mother or a father or a relative, good or bad, this or that in the world, just see the self. Whenever you are not growing spiritually, you are growing in other direction. Day by day, either one grows in spirituality, it means one gets established more and more in the self by letting go of the ego, or the other way. More and more he is reinforcing the ego. When we are not conscious of our true nature, when we are always perceiving this world from the point of view of individual sense, ego, it means we are reinforcing the delusion day by day. We are growing in the ego. If we are growing in spirituality, the ego, this individual sense, this delusion has to dissolve more and more. Like an ice in a hot water, day by day this delusion of individual sense has to dissolve. Then we are growing spiritually. So we have to analyze ourselves, self-analysis, that are we growing spiritually, are we growing in ego? So we have to self-analyze and correctly judge ourselves day by day. Am I growing in spiritually? Am I getting more and more established in the true self and see everything as the self? Every time you express ego, you are growing downward. So on a daily basis, in the workspace, in the family, every time when I look from the place of ego as an identity, I am growing downward because I am reinforcing this delusion. Every time I lose consciousness of my true self and I behave as a conditioned ego and I perceive the world from the place of the conditioned ego, I am giving energy, I am recharging this delusion. It means I am growing downward. I am reinforcing the veil of my true self. I am growing towards duality. I am growing in vulnerability, bondage, suffering. I am making myself vulnerable to the external circumstances. If I perceive this world from the place of ego, individual sense, totally losing my awareness about my true nature, awareness of myself. The more you grow, the more you can face your ego. The more we establish in ourselves, the more we are clear in our wisdom, the more we are clear about our true nature, the more we have this spiritual strength, the more we can face our ego. Even when we are established in the spiritual, in the true self, the situations externally will bring up this ego identity from this conditioned mind to the surface. So, who is going to win? Is this new wisdom of our true self, that we are eternal formless existence? Is this spiritual true identity? Is this going to win, or the ego, conditioned ego, is it going to win? So this depends upon the strength of our establishing in the self. it has to grow day by day. So this is called Nididhyasana. So first we have heard about the truth, then we have repeatedly heard about the truth, and we clarified ourselves. We have clarified all our doubts regarding our true nature, and we have no doubt that this individual sense is just a delusion. It's a false belief that there can never be an individual. There is only one thing which is expressing as everything. And we are very clear, then we have to live it. We have to live this truth in the day-to-day life. So this takes time. Understanding and clarity about the truth and the experiential, intuitive experience about our true nature, which is just being without not being a body, mind or ego, and just being, pure consciousness, not conscious about something, just being consciousness. When we are the pure being and pure consciousness, we will experience the pure bliss. And this intuitive experience, we have to live it day by day. In the day-to-day life, we have to live from this place. We have to, even when the body is moving, even when the mind is moving, even when we are engaged in work, we should not leave this place of pure being. We should be seated, cemented in this place of pure being and experience the day-to-day life. We should never get down, totally losing consciousness of our true nature and becoming an conditioned ego. So this we have to practice day by day. This is called Nididhyasana, and this takes time depending upon one's previous conditioned false concept. We have a lot of false concept about our identity. Depending upon the strength and solidity of this false concept in our mind, this Nididhyasana takes time. When things bother us and we look for the source, we find our ego. So the one who is practicing Nididhyasana, so when we are established in the true self and going through the life experiences as per destiny, even though when we are established in our true nature, so this body mind has to go through the destiny. So when we are going through the destiny, being established in the true self, whenever we face any trouble, when external things bother us, when we are established in the true self, but still some external things bother us, we are getting distracted, disturbed, we become anxious, fearful, guilty. So when we are distracted, then if we contemplate what is that which is bothering us, what is that which distracted us, what is that which got disturbed by the external circumstances, then we will find definitely an ego behind this inner disturbance. Without the ego, there can never be a disturbance from external circumstances. If there is a disturbance within us, then there is an ego, hidden identity, which is disturbed by the external circumstances. So we have to self-analyze on a day-to-day basis. What are the things which disturbs us? What are the situations and the person and the place which has disturbed us? And we have to find out a corresponding ego identity within us. And we have to shine the light of true self over it and see that it is false. The falsity, false sense of ego which is hiding inside us has created this disturbance. The whole object of the path is to let go of the ego. What remains is the self. The self, the true self, we are already that. The Brahman, consciousness, existence, consciousness, bliss, we are already that. The only thing we have to let go is the false sense of individuality, which is covering this true self, this false viewpoint, that false take of who we are, this imagination, this delusion. Only we have to let go of this. When we can let go of everything which can be let go, then whatever remains is our true self. It's like when an actor is wearing the clothes of a role, drama role which he is playing. There is a makeup, there is a costume for that role. He is wearing everything. He has put makeup from morning till evening and is playing a role in the drama. When he removes everything, all the makeup which can be removed over his face, remove all the dress, then whatever left is his true body. Like that, our true self, over this consciousness, we are imagining that I am a separate individual entity. When we can remove everything, then the self, whatever left is the self which is already there. The self, there is no need to bring the self from somewhere. There is no need to practice something to become the self. We are already that. The only thing is let go of the delusion that I am a separate individual entity. The whole thing is very simple. Any complexity in life is the ego trying to undo the simplicity of reality. The reality is very, very simple, which is already there. Everything we see, we hear, we think, everything is the true self, the consciousness. Only complexity exists because of this ego, this false delusion, this limited viewpoint. Depending upon the solidity of the ego, the life will look more complex, proportionately complex. Life appears complex proportionate to the solidity of the delusion of individual separate sense. The more the separate sense dissolves, the more the life becomes simple. And when we are fully established in the self, the life becomes simplest. Because reality is simplicity. When we are fully established in the true nature, life becomes so simple. Only the ego makes it complex. It's the ego that makes life difficult. In reality, life is very simple. Everything happens by itself. There is no individual doing anything. Only the false sense of individuality makes us to believe that we are responsible for something. We have to do something. There is something to do. There is something to change. There is something to achieve. Think you are a limited ego. And the more you think so, the more effort you need to get along. It is the ego that requires effort. There is only one basic trouble in this world. It is the common denominator of all problems. It is trying to be an ego. Trying to maintain this separate individual sense, trying to build up, trying to improve upon this individual, false individual sense. This is the only trouble in this world. This delusion. Identify with the ego and you identify with trouble. So if you want trouble, then identify yourself as an individual entity. If you don't want trouble, then identify yourself, the true nature. Just be who you are. If you want trouble, then imagine that you are an individual. You will have lots and lots of trouble. We should shift from a desire to go out of misery to desire to let go of the ego. We should shift from a desire to let go of misery to a desire to let go of ego. A true seeker, if he has a little more wisdom, intuitive knowledge, he should go one step higher than these ignorant people who are always running away from misery. Normally, people want to run away from misery, but a seeker in a spiritual path has to have the desire to run away from the ego, because ego is the root cause of misery. As long as we maintain this separate individual sense, there will be misery, one misery after another, one problem after another, one trouble after another, because this false sense of individuality is the root cause of all the troubles in the world, from the individual trouble to the troubles in the family to the troubles in the world. This false sense that there are individual separate things. So spiritual seeker has to have the desire to let go of this individual sense. He should not have the desire of letting go of the misery. Misery cannot be let go as long as the ego, we are maintaining this ego. So the spiritual seeker has to address the root cause of misery. He should not run for superficial solutions, temporary solutions, like an ignorant person does. Spiritual seeker has to address the root cause of trouble. The one root cause which is responsible for all the troubles at all times. So we should have this higher desire of letting go of the ego. As the day goes by, the more and more this individual false delusion has to dissolve, so that the more and more we are free from suffering, we are free from misery. When there is no ego involved, we see things exactly as they are. We are blinded to the degree of our ego. So whatever happens in the life, in an external world, in the life situation, day-to-day life, when we are perceiving the life from the true self, then we see things exactly as they are. We will not exaggerate anything. We will not downplay anything. We will see things exactly as they are. Our perception will not be distorted. When we are perceiving from the true self, from the true oneness, from the consciousness, from the existence consciousness, bliss, not from the place of the body, mind, ego. When we perceive from this place, when we are seated, when our identity is established in this place and we are looking through the body, mind, ego, not looking from the body, mind, ego, looking through the body, mind, ego from the true self. When we do not lose the consciousness of the true self and perceive this world, the external world, life, through the instruments of body, mind, ego, then we see things exactly as they are. But when we look from as an identity, individual sense, then we exaggerate things depending upon the solidity and the weight and strength of the ego. The more the ego, the more our perceptions are distorted. The more solid the ego, the more we exaggerate things. Even we will exaggerate a small trouble, small misery proportionately depending upon the solidity of our ego. The more the ego, the more we are deluded. Our perception will be distorted. Our decisions will be unrelatable. We will be reacting in an exaggerated way, in an unrelated way. So, when there is no ego involved, we see things exactly as they are. We are blinded to the degree of our ego. Wanting our ego to be accepted, we see things the way we think they will help us to be accepted. Wanting our ego to be accepted, we see things the way we think they will help us to be accepted. So the ego, when we look through the ego, the things are distorted. So the ego doesn't want to get hurt. The ego doesn't want to dissolve. It doesn't want to be damaged. So it will have a biased perception. It will not accept, it will not be open to the truth of what's happening. So we can't really communicate with an egoistic, strongly deluded individual sense. Those who are having a strong deluded individual sense, they will not be able to see the reality as it is. Whatever we try to communicate with them, they can't perceive because their perception is deluded. Because they doesn't want the ego to be damaged. If they accept the truth as it is, it might be threatening to their ego, the situations and the happenings. So they will avoid perceiving the truth. If you have any emotion, it is ego motivated. Whatever emotion, excitement, suffering, depression, jealousy, fear, guilty feeling, whatever emotion, it is ego motivated. If there is only self, if I am identified with the self, I will see only the self. There is no way of emotion to be there for a longer period of time. It is only serenity and bliss because we see only ourselves everywhere. There is nothing to be excited about. We see everything as self. What is there to be excited about? What is there to suffer? What is there to be jealous about? Who is there other than ourselves to be jealous about? So if there is an emotion, it is ego motivated. So the emotion is the smell. So using the smell, we have to reach where is the ego. Who is having this emotion? So we will find out a dead rat. We will find out this ego. You will find out this delusion, false belief that I am a separate individual sense. This ego which is hiding inside us is giving rise to this emotion. So a spiritual seeker has to use this emotion to retrace, to go back from where it is arising to whom it is arising. Then he can catch hold of an ego. Any human need or desire is ego motivated. My ego thinks it needs things. Myself feels and knows that everything is mine. Any human need or desire is ego motivated. My ego thinks it needs things. Myself, true self, feels and knows that everything is mine. When I am the seawater, when I identify myself with the seawater, wherever I go, if I go 500 kilometers south, I will see only seawater. If I travel 500 kilometers north, I will see only seawater. East, south. After 10 years, there will be only seawater. So for the seawater, there is no need to desire about anything, because in the sea, there is nothing other than itself. All the bubbles, all the waves, all the ice, everything is itself already. Then why the seawater has to travel somewhere to desire what the seawater can desire in the sea? But if we identify ourselves with a wave, particular name and form, I am this wave having the particular shape and height and a form, then if I travel 500 kilometers south, then I will see some other kind of waves in a different form. There will be a bigger wave, there will be a smaller wave, then there will be water bubbles, then there will be ice, then there is something to desire about. Likewise, if I am an individual entity, since I identify myself as an individual body, mind, ego with a particular form and character, then there is a lack. Then I have to desire something to fulfill that lack or to improve upon my body, mind or ego. But when I am the true self, which is appearing as everything, then there is nothing to desire, because I am already everything. We should have no wants, then we are never in trouble. If I am the true self, there is nothing to desire, because there is nothing other than myself in this world, then there is no trouble. If I have no wants, then what is the trouble? Only when my wants are not fulfilled, then I will be in trouble. When I have no wants, then there is no trouble. Talking is asking for ego attention. It's wanting ego approval. If you will remain quiet, you may feel that happiness that you are seeking through making the noise. Talking is asking for ego attention. It's wanting ego approval. If you will remain quiet, you may feel that happiness that you are seeking through making the noise. So whenever we are in a particular conversation, either in our workspace or a family, the more egoistic a person, the more he will be talkative. So he will come into this conversation, intrude into this conversation unnecessarily, and he wants to gain attention. The ego wants to feed upon this conversation. It wants to be validated. It wants to prove its knowledge. So every opportunity, the egoistic, the more the solid the ego, it will try to use every conversation as a food for itself. It wants to feel superior. It wants to prove the other person wrong. The more the solidity of the ego, the more proportionately that person will be talkative and use every situation as an ego feed. If you remain quiet, you may feel that happiness that you are seeking through making the noise. Almost every time we talk, we are asking for ego acceptance. Every conversation from the place of ego, as identified with this ego individual sense, it expects acceptance from the other person, so that it's a feed for that ego. The more people accept an ego, it is fed more. So it will try to use every situation, every conversation as a feed for itself. It's asking for acceptance. Ego is only destructive to one. So everyone who has ego is destructive to the degree he has ego. Everyone who has ego is destructive to the degree he has ego. So ego, individual sense, this delusion that I am a separate individual entity. I am responsible, I am doing something, I am enjoying something. This delusion is the root cause of all the trouble, and the real spiritual growth is letting go of this delusion, and whatever left is our true self. From the place of true self, if we perceive, if we see, if we look through, then we see the self everywhere, the one self appearing as everything. Then we are out of all the trouble and the suffering, and we perceive the life as it is, and the life becomes so simple and easy and clear without draining our energy unnecessarily.